Erev Tov Rabotai, we are continuing with our Mishna Yomi Masechet Bava Metzia. We are up to Perek Yud Mishnah Aleph. Today's Mishnayot should be Le'ilui Nishmat Neria ben Svetlana Ranbai Veliyahu ben Burcha Israelov Chana bat Miriam Sason ben Ryan Yoshua ben Shifra Menuchatam beGan Eden Amen and Avdi ben Chaim Lechaim b'derefua Shelemav Daniel Shalom ben Rosa b'tor Shachole Israel and Achlama Merav Benjamin Or Tzion Chai ben Dvorah. This chapter deals with laws that apply to properties situated one on top of the other. The first three Mishnayot discuss neighbors who live in a two-story house that has two separate apartments, one on the ground floor and one on the upper floor. This Mishnah discusses a case where each apartment was owned by a different person and the house collapsed. It teaches how the owners divide the usable materials found in the rubble. Habayit va'aliyah shel shnaim shenaflu. If a two-story house belonging to two people collapsed, shneim cholkim ba'etzim u'ba'avanim u'be'afar, the two of them divide the usable wood, stones, and earth that they find in the rubble based on the size of the two apartments. Now, a house usually has stones or bricks in its structure, wood in the ceilings, and earth that was used to cement the stones together. This they would divide based on the size of the two apartments. For example, if both apartments were the same size, each owner takes half of the material. By law, each owner owns the building materials that came from his apartment. However, since we cannot tell which parts of the rubble came from which apartment, the owners simply divide the materials according to the size of the apartments. The Mishnah discusses how the stones are divided, if some are whole and some are broken. If it can be determined how the house collapsed, the following method is used to divide the stones. Ve'roim elu avanim hariyot li'ishtaber. We determine which stones were more likely to have broken, meaning we examine the way the house fell and determine which story stones were more likely to have broken in the collapse. The owner of that story receives the broken stones. For example, if the house caved in, presumably the stones from the lower floor broke and caused the rest of the structure to collapse. The stones from the upper floor, though, likely remained whole. Therefore, the owner of the upper story gets the whole stones and the owner of the ground floor gets the broken ones. If, however, the house fell to its side, meaning it was blown over by a strong wind, the stones of the upper story were more likely to have broken since they fell from a greater height than the lower stones did. In that case, the owner of the upper story receives the broken stones and the owner of the ground floor takes the whole ones. If it cannot be determined how the house fell, for example, it fell at night when no one saw it fall and passerby moved the rubble from its original position, the two owners divide both the whole and broken stones based on the size of their apartments as taught in the Mishnah's first ruling. If one of the owners recognized some of his stones among the unbroken stones, notlan, he may take them even if they are more valuable than the other stones. For example, the stones he identifies are larger or of better quality than the other stones. He may take these stones only if there is a reason for his claim to be believed. For example, if the other owner admits that those stones are indeed his. And they are counted toward the total amount of unbroken stones he is entitled to. For example, if he is supposed to get 50 unbroken stones, he can take the stones he recognizes as part of his 50 stones. The unbroken stones are divided in the manner described earlier in the Mishnah. If it can be determined how the house fell, they are divided based on that calculation. Otherwise, they are divided according to the size of the apartments. If one owner recognizes some stones, he does not gain more stones. He can simply choose the ones he recognized, even if they are more valuable, in place of the other stones. And that is then a Mishnah Aleph. Mishnah Bet discusses a two-story house that is owned by one person who lives on the ground floor and rents out the second story to someone else. Habayit va'aliyah shel shnaim. A two-story house is occupied by two people. The owner of the house lives on the ground floor and the tenant lives in the upper story. Nifchata aliyah, if the floor of the upper story fell in, a large enough section of the floor collapsed so that the tenant no longer has full use of his apartment. Then Baal Habayit rotzeh letaken, and the owner of the house does not want to fix it. Hare Baal aliyah yored v'dar lemata. The occupant of the upper story may go down and live below in the ground floor apartment. Until the owner fixes the floor of the upper story for him. This law does not apply in every case. The Mishnah refers to a unique case where the landlord had said at the time of the rental, I am renting you this upper story which is on top of this ground floor. By adding the words which is on top of this ground floor, he is indicating that if the upper apartment becomes unusable, he will provide the lower apartment as a replacement. If he did not mean to promise this, there would have been no need for him to add that extra phrase, since it's obvious that the upper story is on top of the ground floor. Therefore, if the floor of the upper apartment collapses, the tenant may live in the lower apartment until it is fixed. If the landlord did not use such an expression at the time of the rental, the tenant does not have the right to live on the ground floor. Whether or not the landlord is obligated to repair the floor at all depends on the phrases used and the terms is set at the time of the rental, as discussed in chapter 8, Mishnah 9. According to the next Tana, the landlord is responsible for only part of the repair. Rabbi Yossi says, the occupant of the lower apartment, the landlord, is required to provide only the wood of the ceiling of the lower apartment, which is the floor of the upper apartment, and the occupant of the upper apartment provides the plaster that covers the wood. This plaster is not needed to strengthen the floor, but simply ensure that it is smooth and flat. Since the upper apartment is livable without the plaster, the landlord is not obligated to provide it. The Tana Kama, on the other hand, holds that the plaster also serves to reinforce the ceiling and makes the upper apartment livable. Therefore, the landlord must provide plaster, and the tenant can live downstairs until the landlord does so. And the Rav tells us, that Rav follows the opinion of the sages. And that is the Rabotai of today's Mishna Yomi. Baruch Adonai Leolam. Amen v'amen.